By 1937, the Japanese have expanded even further in a full-scale war. The Sino-Japanese or Chinese-Japanese War is on. And in that same year, in 1937, the Japanese sink an American gunboat, the Panay, on the Yangtze River. The Japanese apologize for this and pay a large indemnity for it, and the United States is fine with that, which shows you the degree of isolationism the United States is confronting. An American man of war is sunk by the Japanese. Some argue deliberately, and all we say is, well, just don't do it again. So this is the road that's going to lead us in many ways in the European theater, these same kinds of models. During this time period, Hitler's going to come to power in 1930s in the middle of the Depression in Germany. And like Mussolini, he's a fascist. A fascist is a political philosophy. It's a collection of ideas and prejudices that include supremacy of the state over the individual, dictatorship over democracy, I guess you could say, authoritarianism over freedom of speech, and militarism over peace. These were sort of the attitudes of fascism. These were guys who, for lack of a better term, they get things done. And with this, they were going to purify Germany of the Jewish race and of their problems that the Jews brought. That's what the Nazis argued. And Mussolini, for his part, in Italy, wants to try to build a new Roman Empire. He's going to attempt to, with fascism, expand the Italian footprint, and the Germans are going to expand, the Nazis are going to expand the German footprint in Europe as much as they can. In 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia to try to extend some colonial territories and holdings. The Western powers do nothing. Hitler watches this. In 1936, Adolf Hitler reoccupies the Rhineland, this tiny little region here where my pinky finger is, reoccupies this region which was supposed to be demilitarized forever based on the Treaty of Versailles. He sends his troops in, France and England watch and do nothing. And each of these moves is going to embolden the dictators, embolden the fascist states even more. If they can get a little, they're going to say, well, what else can we get? And this is the nature of the democratic response from the free democracies. Their response of non-resistance is called appeasement. If we can just satisfy these fascist states with a few nibbles, maybe that'll be enough. Maybe they'll stop. But as Lyndon Johnson will famously say in referencing a different war, if you let a bully stay on your front lawn one day, the next day he'll be on your front porch. The fascists were never satisfied. They always upped their demands and increased their demands because they knew they could. The more they pushed, the more they got, the more they got, the more they pushed. During this entire time, then, with each crisis, isolationist sentiment in the United States grows. This is a time period when, based on the literature of the Lost Generation, based on the bitter aftertaste of the First World War, Americans feel that somehow we'd been suckered, we'd been played, we'd been duped into getting into World War I. And the fact that we'd actually engaged in a European conflict, we felt like we had somehow been chumps or suckers for having done so. And so the logic was, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We were never again going to get fooled. And as a result, we pass a whole series of legislative acts designed to make sure that we never get in this sort of situation again. In the 1930s, there's significant rereading of the history of the First World War, and the Nye Committee reports come out of Washington. An investigative congressional committee concludes that, shockingly enough, which everyone sort of understood and knew, war manufacturers, munitions makers, and weapons makers all made fabulous profits in the United States during World War I as the war was going on. In this isolationist time period, these are labeled as the so-called merchants of death. And to make sure that we can never sell our way into a war again by selling goods to fighting or belligerent powers that are going to lead us to make more investments in that way to back up our first investment, we passed a whole series of neutrality laws designed to strengthen our isolationist beliefs. Neutrality Act of 1935, it prohibited arms shipments to either side in a belligerent or a conflict struggle. In other words, we will not sell war weapons to anyone because wherever money goes, our interests ultimately sort of going to have to follow. Neutrality Act of 36, it forbade loans. We're not going to give loans to belligerents because a belligerent being a warring power, AP term. If you give loans to warring powers, to one side, not the other, if the side you give loans to loses, the chances of you getting paid back are pretty slim. So what happened in World War I is the more money we loaned to the Allies, the more we wound up doubling down and loaning them additional money to cover and make sure that we get back our first loans, which will lead to more money after that and after that, which is why, as we'd seen in earlier lessons, the Germans argued that by 1917, when the United States declared war, America could hardly help anymore if they were actually in the war, which was the feeling and attitude of the Germans, at least. The big act, of course, after the start of the Spanish Civil War, is the Neutrality Act of 1937. You remember the ocean line to Lusitania, which was sunk in World War I. American lives were lost. We were traveling on a British vessel, a British ocean liner when this happened. Neutrality Act of 37 forbids Americans from traveling on vessels owned by warring nations. So the idea is, don't fool me again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. No more Lusitanias. We will not permit our citizens to travel there. Now this is significant because these acts, what they are doing, these laws, reflect American public opinion giving up on a political principle, a diplomatic principle that we'd hung our hat on for about 120 years, the principle of freedom of the seas. If you remember back to your AP1 course and your reviews, it was this notion of being able to trade with warring nations as a neutral power that got us in trouble in the 1780s after the French Revolution. It got us into the War of 1812 with Britain when we were trying to trade with Napoleonic France and with Great Britain. It got us into trouble in 1914 to 1917 when we wanted to trade with both sides and the Germans U-boats torpedoed our ships and the British blockaded our ability to trade with the Central Powers. This had been such a consistent theme of American foreign policy, and now we say it's not worth it. We jettison that theme. That's a significant event to have given up on that during this time. Now, the high point of appeasement comes in 1938 with Hitler annexing Austria and then the Munich Agreement. In the Munich Agreement, Hitler makes claims on parts and pieces of Czechoslovakia, the outer western regions of Czechoslovakia, the so-called Sudetenland. And he argues that if I don't get those lands, there'll be war, but if the democracies can see to it that Czechoslovakia gives up these lands, this is my last territorial demand in Europe. The democracies knuckle under, at which point Hitler concludes that the democracies, being the French and British governments, under enormous pressure, convinced Czechoslovakia to give up those regions. Within 8 months, Hitler takes over the rest of Czechoslovakia too. But in so doing, it convinces Hitler the democracies are so cowardly, so corrupt, so weak, and so hollow that he no longer needs to make pretense anymore and pretend to negotiate for what he wants. He can simply take what he wants. And his next major move in Europe will be the commencement of hostilities against Poland, which traditionally was seen in September 1st, 1939 as the traditional beginning of the First World War. Now, with this beginning, you see at this same time in America formal political organizations devoted to either keeping the United States out of the war or arguing that the British and French are fighting our fight. The first organization that shows up in 1940 would be the America First Committee, which is most famous member is Charles Lindbergh, which said largely that the United States should build a fortress America, don't worry about the rest of the world, we do not need to engage ourselves in those foreign affairs. As the war goes on and moves forward, the notion of so-called blitzkrieg, the German notion of lightning war. They strike rapidly with mechanized divisions and air assaults, and one by one, or two or three at the same time, they start gobbling up the nations of the map of Europe. They takes them all a couple hours, a couple days to take over Denmark, they take over Norway, they're going to move into, they've already have Austria, they move into Poland. The French were thought to have the most powerful army on the continent. And in the spring of 1940, the Nazis dispatch the French. They take over the French. They force the French to surrender in 6 weeks. This scares the daylights out of the American people because now all of a sudden this abstract otherism that's over there now seems real because now the Germans have a front porch on the Atlantic Ocean and on the other side is you know who, you're looking at us. And so at this point in time, a different group arises, the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. William White was their most prominent spokesman. They argued that Britain, standing alone, was now fighting our fight. And as a result, that we should do everything possible to defend ourselves by aiding the British. And this was going to lead to an entire series of events that are going to very much bring the United States into the Second World War, although our direct involvement is going to come from the attack at Pearl Harbor on the other side of the world. But Roosevelt needed the support of isolationists to win the 36 election. But he worried by 38 that even though he'd supported appeasement, that the U.S. was not ready for any kind of wartime activity should it come to us, and it was coming quicker than we were going to be ready. The American public throughout the 1930s and into the 40s, into the early 40s, they give FDR conflicting advice. They say it's very important for us to defeat Hitler, or they say Hitler should be defeated, we should aid the Allies, but stay out of the war. All three of those things can't happen. Two can happen very easily, but not with one other one. And so what we're going to see is during this time, Roosevelt's going to gradually reverse these neutrality laws. We're going to move, the American government's going to move from strict neutrality to aid, to undeclared war, and then ultimately, finally, to war itself.